Good morning, everyone. Bonjour à tous. Je m'appelle Kayona.
My name is Kayona, and I am member of the Evaluation Report Committee for CSPC. We acknowledge that the Conference on Science Policy is taking place on the unsurrendered and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, whose presence here goes back to time immemorial. We respect our traditional hosts and thank them for allowing us to work on their territory.
This next session is entitled, How Can Cities Work Together to Access Better Evidence? It is organized by le Fonds de Recherche du Québec. Please don't forget to tweet your feedback and tweet on these events and panels that you are attending. We would really appreciate your feedback, and we'd also encourage you to fill out your feedback on the app so that we can use this feedback to make next year's conference an even better experience. Thank you very much, and I hope that you enjoy the session.
Merci beaucoup, Kayona. Merci.
Thank you, Kayona. Thank you to CSPC for this invitation and to allow us to be here.
Take place mainly in French, but if you need support, I think there are some devices available for translation there. Thank you. Thanks to the CSPC. Thank you very much for that. So le panel va se passer principalement.
So the panel will be mainly in French.
You are welcome to say them in English, and we'll make sure that you are well understood. Mais pour le principal, comme nos panélistes.
But since our panelists are francophones, it will be a pleasure to have this panel in French. So this panel, as Kayona was saying, is organized by the Fonds de Recherche du Québec, and specifically the head scientist office of Quebec. And I take a moment to introduce myself. I'm Julie Diver. I work in that office. And you have to know that the head scientist in Quebec has as a mandate to advise and promote scientific advice in Quebec for policymakers. And municipalities are part of that receiving population. And they've been interested in the last few years in the way that we can better support municipalities to provide them the knowledge that they might require. And we have tried many different formulas, different forms of advice that we try to implement, and we're delighted to be able to discuss all that with you today. So we'll be mainly looking into the main formula, global to local, local to global. We often hear that formula. It is very present in the speech to make more operational the sustainable development goals. We say innovation and mobilization would come from the streets, from the community. That's where the real change would happen. And then we would scale that up to get a global change. So the question is, does it work? This local to global and vice versa. So we'll be discussing that. And we'll start by looking at that municipal scale. Do municipalities have the role, have the possibility of playing that role of innovators in society? We'll be discussing that with 4 of the panelists that we have today. First of all, Christian Schreibert, thank you for being with us. He's the General Director of the City of Lorraine. Sainte-Thérèse, sorry. You changed, didn't you? I should have known. Sainte-Thérèse. So great experience in various cities of Quebec. So he's very experienced. And he's also Vice President of the Association of Director Generals of Quebec Municipalities, ADGMQ. And so he can give us a very experienced point of view in terms of municipal administration. Then In terms of elected reps experience, we have François-William Croteau, who was mayor of Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie, the district in the city of Montreal, and now advisor on climate transition with Novitec. Thank you for being with us. And more on the side of Municipal Federation, we have Rachel Deslauriers, senior manager for programs at the FCM, and Nicolas Biron, who's a specialist in green economy and circular economy at the IFDD, who will be presenting how cities associate themselves to take on those challenges. So the way this will happen, a pretty traditional way, essentially we'll first ask a question to each of our panelists, and they can that way introduce themselves and give their first reading on this topic, and then we'll be discussing, and we obviously hope that you will have questions for the four panelists. I'll start with Nicolas Biron. When you work at the IFDD, how do cities tackle these objectives of sustainable development? Do they get a benefit in working together? How do you help them to tackle this huge challenge that are sustainable development goals? Thank you very much. I think that is a major challenge when we work with cities and municipalities. So to let you know, the IFDD is based in Quebec. We're under the International Organization of Francophonie, but we're specialized on issues of sustainable development. So with the United Nations, we work on those sustainable development goals, and since 2015, we have worked alongside different of our member states, especially African states, to elaborate national plans for sustainable development. And why do we do that for municipalities? Well, take an example. Burkina Faso is a country with 380 municipalities, and the objectives for sustainable development, 17 objectives, 169 targets. That's a lot for the territories, the municipalities, where you can have a real impact. So take the question of food, transportation, sustainable cities, climate. We talk a lot about that with the COP, and that's happening a lot in municipalities. Having said this, cities often come and see us and say, well, listen, 17 objectives for sustainable development, 169 targets, 235 more indicators. I'm a medium-sized city. I have a couple people who know sustainable development. What do we do? And that's why the IFDD has developed various tools to help those municipalities to establish priorities. First of all, to understand their targets and set priorities, and to be able to say, I have 169 targets. Out of those, in terms of my city, my challenges, there are maybe 5, 6, 7 urgencies, 12 priorities, things that are more medium term. And from there, we can work with them to identify strategic focuses and to elaborate a local plan for sustainable development. But there are obviously challenges that we encountered. First thing we notice, and that cities notice quickly when we do that work with them, is that the sustainable development goals are complex in the sense that everything is linked. When you can't speak of climate today without talking of transportation linked to biodiversity, and they each have a number in terms of SDG. Everything is linked, and every action we undertake to reach one target or another will have a positive or negative effect on other targets. So all that has to be well understood, and for that we need resources, not only financial, but human resources that understand those things. And that's where it's often very difficult at the local scale, because we don't always have critical data to make the right decision on each of the targets. I've had several experiences in cities abroad, especially here in Quebec, where we study, for example, one given target for sustainability, access to water or waste management, and around the table you have various experts, all the stakeholders of the city are invited, and each expert comes up with their own report, and on this I get 3 different stats for the same indicator. It's not always easy to know what's the actual situation and to be able to make the right decision. And that's a challenge because we can see that today, and with climate too, we don't have the luxury of trial and error. We need every dollar invested to be efficient and get an impact for it. We can't just make investments that will be locked up and not help us to a sustainable development. So we need that data, it's difficult to get it, and paradoxically, the city is often the place where, in theory, we could contribute to get that data. In African cities, for example, where we often work, there's the question of access to water, and water treatment is essential, and it's only in the municipality that we can know who has access to water treatment, to water. So, okay, there's a national program that came to finance wells, but how many of those wells are done? How many still work? How many are dry? It's the city that can give us that information. Same thing for transportation, for poverty as well. So the question of data and information is very critical. The second thing we observe is that these SDGs call for a deep change in terms of mode of development. I'll give you an example. Let's take climate again. We know it's the conference of parties happening in Egypt right now. To reach the climate objectives, we'd have to reduce global emissions by half by 2030 and aim towards neutrality by 2050. What does that mean, reduce by half our emissions? If to put things in context, during the pandemic, where there were no planes flying, factories were stopped, we reduced our emissions by 5.4% globally, and we've already made up for that since. Whereas we should reduce by 50%. That gives us an idea of the scale and sheer magnitude of reductions we need to do. And even in municipalities, our choices should aim towards this type of development. I hesitate to say that we need a radical change because that's scary, but a huge change needs to be done. And there's also the fact that every change fundamentally requires a collective process. So I come to this collaboration that's fundamental. Already within cities, I have seen many times, even within cities, partners who didn't necessarily speak to each other, stakeholders working in silos. That happens. I'll just talk of our experience when we are in Francophone countries. But those are situations that unfortunately we still see a lot. And same thing for collaboration between cities. We were discussing that earlier when we talk about sustainable development for cities, we're talking of circular economy. And when we talk about that applied to cities, we need to collaborate. We don't have a choice. In the past, maybe we were in a situation where cities could be in competition to attract employment, investment. If we have this logic of circularity, the resources of a city can contribute to another, etc. And we have to think about regional collaboration. It's fundamental. And so what we're doing at the IFDD, we have developed methodological tools, some approaches to enable cities to understand those SDGs, to understand their strengths, weaknesses. We give the tools, we don't do it, but they are the stakeholders and they can identify and all that and see which are the targets that are priorities, and from then onwards they can elaborate a local plan for sustainable development. We help them to develop their plan, we help them to organize the structure and data collection. If we do a partnership with universities in Quebec, at Université du Québec in Chicoutimi and Laval, and we can accompany them up to elaborating their volunteer local report to implement the SDGs. That's something we see more and more. Countries are called upon to do their national report for SDGs, but cities are starting to do it too. So that's what we see for francophonie, and that's the way that we support cities to better understand their targets and work amongst themselves to share their experiences on different actions they can undertake on the targets that can be joined to one priority or the other. And that's how, in the francophone space, we try to share those good practices, whether for the tools or the actions they can undertake to get there. Thank you, Mr. Biron. Mr. Schubert, we were talking earlier of the urgency, priorities, silos. Those are notions that are very familiar to you for municipal administration. Could you tell us in what sense Canadian municipalities, in the way they are governed, can they play their role of innovation that they should play? If so, how? I think cities are the best place to bring innovation in all that on the territory. However, cities tend to repeat what we've done. It's much easier to repeat what you've done before. If you're developing a city, you want to do a park, you'll reproduce what you did 20 years ago because it's simple. It's cheaper and you won't ask yourselves too many questions. You won't take into account the new needs of the population that have changed. It doesn't mean it's always like that, but that's the primary trend. We see our employees who say it's like that, I've done that for 20 years, why should we change? So we have work to do on changing habits, and when we bring innovation, then we have other challenges. Cities are 4-year mandates, 4-year cycles, so unfortunately we think short term, and it's not always true. I have a former mayor next to me who might say the contrary, but it is true. We see that more and more, that people are thinking longer term, depending on the generation of the elected reps. But unfortunately, we often hear, I'm here for 4 years and I want to do something right away. And if we think of innovation, doing research, that stretches time, and elected reps want tangible results right away so they can put it on their balance sheet. So that's a challenge. And there's the will to act from elected reps is not always there, and it depends on the visions. There are cities in Quebec that took the turn for innovation, eco-fiscality, green taxation, but they work on all those issues. But other cities are not there yet. Nicolas was speaking about the size of a city. It's a challenge when you're talking of a municipality of 200 people with 300,000 square kilometers of territory. They don't have the same resources, human or financial, to be able to work on innovation. They'll do what they can do with the resources they have. However, when we speak of large cities, there are more means, but I look forward to hearing Francois speak about it later. But the situation there is that you have different districts where they're each competing, trying to attract a certain population. We had the issue of housing. It's changing somewhat with trade, with businesses coming back after the pandemic, but there's that issue that's complicated. We want to bring innovation, but there are many obstacles you have to overcome. You have to show the added value for the population. However, what I see often is that when there's an urgency, then we will work together, collaborate. When there's climate change, for example, their cities don't have a choice. They'll say, well, we have realities. How can we work together for an issue of watershed or river, the increase in temperatures, homelessness? In many files of public health, you don't have a choice. You have to work together. And it's once you reach the end of your own possibilities, you have to work with others. And cities are living similar realities. In Quebec, we have the MRCs. You have similar things in Ontario, groupments of municipalities, and that's where the role of innovation will be important. I'll take the example of Sainte-Thérèse, where I work. the MRC wants to work on artificial intelligence, but what does that actually mean for us? And we'll be working with universities and research centers to try and implement innovation that will serve all the cities. Data exchange is also a challenge because we feel that we are competing with neighboring cities. People don't understand why we would give that information, what it could be used for, and some people could use it for different means. We often see that on social media. We lose the sense of the message. So elected reps fear of negative impact from this. But I was doing a bit of research because we asked ourselves who could help us to do this, and I discovered that Quebec Public Health have resources in every region to help the cities to implement analyses like impact studies on health. They do vulnerability studies, they take into account social, economic factors, the environment, infrastructure. And there's a project right now called the VRAC Park that's in 14 regions of Quebec, and they are establishing with the different factors for heat island effects, climate change. But one of the issues is communication, is to know that there are resources available, just like to know that there are subsidies available. And we are lacking information there, maybe because there aren't enough resources dedicated to that. I find that the word sustainable development has lost its meaning. We like that word, it's very popular, it's been overused. We're doing sustainable development, but actually what we're doing is not because you're doing waste management and you're putting drinking water on your grass that you're doing sustainable development. So there's all the impact of climate change. Our installations are not built for what we have to face. But the issue is that we don't have the information often, and we don't know where to get that information. Same thing for subsidies. It's very difficult to know what resources you can go get. So I think there would be an advantage in working more together, in getting more information from the government side, the federal side, provincial and municipal as well. So yes, we are the best place to innovate directly, daily, but unfortunately we don't always have the resources. And it should really be a political vision. I keep this idea of vision, and we'll come back to that, but you mentioned the issue of resources going beyond the competitive aspect and working together. And I think it's a good time to pass over to Rachel Deslauriers for the Canadian Federation of Municipalities. And you offer programs and resources. So what solutions could we implement to give more resources to those municipalities who want to innovate? The political willpower is there, but they don't necessarily have access to the knowledge or resources that are available to them. Yes, so the Federation of Canadian Municipalities is the voice for municipalities in Canada from coast to coast at the federal government level. So it's important to understand that each province has their own association, but we are the National Association for Municipalities. And therefore, we have our members and our elected representatives in work groups so that they can discuss together the priorities of work at the federal government level. For example, just affordable social housing is one of the major victories of the FCM this year. It's been many years that we've been working on that need, and now we're even promoting affordable and sustainable housing to make sure that housing be healthy, efficient, eco-efficient. So we've been capable over the years of pushing that envelope for Canadian priorities in terms of sustainable development that's economic, environmental, and sustainable. So to continue on this topic, by grouping municipalities politically by sector of priority for each of them, we can amplify their voices. And that enables us to find solutions. So in terms of the organization in general, we can, for example, have partnerships with entities where they'll have critical data, such as with StatCans, for example, where they'll have an agreement with the FCM to give the data for free to municipalities so that they can think it out and make the right decisions. So that's something that can be done more specifically on environment, sustainable development. The FCM has financing programs to help municipalities to plan their infrastructure or to make appropriate decisions on their investments. So over the last few years, we had three funding programs that were on the management of municipal assets. And the objectives was really to highlight the common denominator for municipalities with a scale of improvement where 0 was no municipal asset and 5 was you're all good, I have a list, I understand what I'm doing. So in that program, we wanted elected reps to understand the importance of municipal management, how to maintain them, life cycle, and a lot of information per groups of practice in the province for each of the provinces so that municipalities have in hand the necessary information to be able to make the right choices. An example of project that's linked to climate change could be for a municipality to do the analysis of all the infrastructure to identify the different items, to know what state they're in, and to put that information on projections with climate change. So the drain we've identified, is it big enough or are we going to have problems? So the possibility of such funding that is very useful for municipalities, but very targeted for them, that is something that the FCM has managed to do.
Sur l'adaptation au changement climatique, donc les municipalités pour l'innovation.
We also have a program for climate change adaptation, and some of the projects wound up this year, but there have been others in cities and municipalities over the last few years. A lot of catastrophes. In the east, we had flooding. In the west, we had forest fires. So it's important to be able to plan and to be able to adapt as well as possible to ensure the resiliency of our infrastructure so that they're less vulnerable. And the other funding stream that's very important is the Green Municipal Fund. So the Green Municipal Fund is so it's residual waste, transportation, and urban planning or land use planning. So we have an agreement with the federal government to create 3 new sectors. So we're very present in the energy file, so we can offer funding for feasibility studies at the municipal level that is going to allow them to pre-qualify for funding for feasibility studies and infrastructure programs. And we also recognize as well that it's important to learn from each other. So each project that lands with us has to share the results, in other words, share the reports. All the results are available on the website, so it's possible to do a search by sector or by region, and that's a minimum, of course. And there are also some practice groups. One that was very popular had to do with the management of contaminated sites. And it's important to realize that most municipalities have an old service station that has to be cleaned up and where the land needs to be revitalized. So this particular group, the consultation group, has been really successful. And but even though the group has wound up has ended its work, the members still continue to exchange information between themselves. So in terms of the applications of what can be done, we've had some smaller municipalities that got together with larger municipalities because the FRQ is a rather technical fund, of course. Smaller municipalities will get together. For example, in Quebec, we have in the Matapédia, we financed a small energy project with 3 buildings, but they amalgamated into a municipal regional council, and they have financial services. So there's somebody at the MRC who has been working to find funding for projects of the kind that I just mentioned in the energy sector. So it's anecdotal because it's not a resource that every municipality can necessarily muster. But given the success in obtaining funding, it's good to disseminate this example. We also have a Francophone municipalities in Manitoba that got together to create their own economic development agency, and within that created a consultancy agency. So they have an environmental consultancy agency, and this is all free until they obtain financing or funding, and then the agency will continue to represent them and to work with them once they obtain funding, the municipalities obtain funding. And now, in terms of practice communities and the municipalities can learn a lot from each other. I was using an analogy a little earlier. Municipalities are all different. They're all specific. Yeah. They're all a different snowflake. But as in the case of snowflakes, it's all snow. So they do have the same realities and the same obligations in the end. And it's important to be able to compare and discuss without being competitive about it. And it does make a big difference. Thank you. Thank you very much, Madame Deslauriers. So we're going to finish with Mr. Croteau. And so as elected official, you're responsible for, you tested certain solutions with the City of Montreal. So what do you foresee as solutions so that cities become more innovative? Well, that's a very broad question, isn't it? Yes. Well, let me begin by saying that talking about the issues that prevent cities, municipalities from being innovative. First of all, if we may make a comparison between a city and a municipality or a private business, we can better understand the complexity or the difficulties that prevent cities from being innovative and why over time they have dropped out of the exploration and innovation game. When you have a private business, say somebody a business that builds smartphones. The only prerogative, of course, is to go after the market and to make a competitive market that is going to get you the greatest number of buyers. So you don't necessarily have to take into account on social media, take into account, or in the media, people who are against your product. Because they have the option of simply not buying it. But when you're in a municipality or a government and you want to create a new policy or introduce a new measure, your product is going to be imposed to everyone. And necessarily, there are going to be a segment of the population that is going to be unsatisfied, and they will disagree with your approach and voice their opinion. And you will have to deal with that complexity in the process of implementation. And once again, if you're managing public funds, you have checks and balances that validate each step to make sure that the policies and the decision-making is done according to process and proper criteria in compliance with the law. whatever regulations. And of course, this is a complex framework. And so these are complexities and steps or stages that in the end make it, that destroy the incentive to test ideas and to be a bit more radically innovative. That would allow us to adapt to change more quickly. So, because municipal politics is complex, it makes municipalities reticent to test new ideas and be frankly innovative. The other obstacle to innovative is the four-year cycle. So in Canada, we have a democracy that is such that municipal elections occur every 4 years. And there's also a year for the breaking in of a new administration after the elections, because the new administration, of course, has to test their strengths. And the first budget, the elected officials are presently adopting their budgets. But usually, the first budget of a new administration is going to be voted 1 month after the election. So imagine you have a new team of elected officials, and you have to, within a month, you have to come up with a budget or adopt the budget of the people that have been voted out of office that may not have the same orientations that the ones you would like to give yourself. So you will have a whole year to adjust and to adapt, to get used to the processes, working with the CEO, and then there's also the election year, which is where politicians are very afraid of adopting policies that could be deemed controversial. So out of a 4-year cycle, there are really 2 years where real work can get done, which is a very short time span. And as such, and the other element that is important in the constraints or the disincentive to innovation is that the public administration that is used to a 4-year cycle become naturally more conservative and balk at innovative ideas that might slow down. And so they might slow down the adoption of new measures to see if there's a chance they'll get a second mandate and have an opportunity to implement these ideas. So all of this put together means that you have an institutional environment that is a disincentive to innovation. And that's why it's difficult to really change the way we do things at the municipal level. So what is the solution, given these important obstacles to innovation? Well, we have to, in my view, there are 3 things that need to be changed so that we can change our approach to innovation. As an elected official, I've done it. I've had the extraordinary opportunity to do my PhD studies while I was a mayor of a district. So it was research in action, and I could test whatever hypotheses I was working on in the real world. And so I tested a lot of solutions and innovative approaches to urban management. So this was, it allowed me to lubricate the public administration and in fact go further and introduce some radical measures. And because as Nicolas was saying, the changes that we're facing are radical, and what we're faced with is going to translate into radical impacts on our society, which means that we have to, if we want to solve the complex issues that we're faced with today, we can't go to simple solutions. We have to go to complex solutions, and that very often involves radical solutions. So the first element, the first major element, is first of all to ask ourselves, how are we governing our cities? So We all have essentially the same problems in the municipal governance. But of course, the complexity of one city can vary from one place to another, depending on the population, the demographics, the surface area, the territory. So the issues can vary depending on the physical environment and the demographics. But cities also have to manage infrastructure, leisure, renovation permits, public roads, and snow removal, and etc. So the work is the same, but the task is different from one city to the next. So we have to ask ourselves, how does this translate at the governance level? How do we mobilize the actors or the stakeholders within a community so that we can encourage experimentation and also foster social acceptability of measures that would be less well received if we just strike out broadly from the get-go? So one of the things I like to say is that very often media or social public commentators find that Montreal is too decentralized and it's too complicated and too complex, and we don't understand who does what. And I like to say that we can't use simple solutions to solve complex problems. So in my view, the city of Montreal is still not decentralized enough, given the complexity of the local issues that exist on its territory. So we have to ask ourselves as to the scale of the intervention that we're contemplating as a public, and we have to imagine measures or initiatives that are at the scale of the problem that we're tackling. So the government of Canada, so we could have a municipal federation, for example, where we would be able to imagine interventions that are going to be specific to the scale of the target. Let's take an example, a simple case that I can. Green side streets in Rosemont. So in 2011, there were 3 green back streets and out of 411. So if we wanted to accelerate the program, we had to accelerate things if we wanted to really transform the territory. And so the idea was to allow the citizens to do the planning and do the work and then maintain the public spaces that we were. And when I raised this possibility during my first meeting with the town planners, in the city, in that district, in Rosemont, the public works director spontaneously blurted out, why don't we give citizens the power to themselves to take up the asphalt? And so I'll spare you the expletives that came out of his mouth. But all that to say that so we started a reform where we allowed citizens to actually take the democratic initiative to talk to their neighbors, come up with the plans, do the actual physical work, and then maintain the green spaces they created. Because of course, we're never as proud of something as the things that we actually do ourselves. So if we want to create innovation, if everything is done by the city, by the state, the citizen doesn't feel concerned and doesn't feel involved or committed. So what happened with this project of a precipitative democracy is that the citizens who weren't in agreement with the whole idea were able to talk to their neighbors. There was a mediation and consultation, negotiation, and people would come to see our elected officials to say, listen, our neighbor isn't convinced that we have and we would always say, look, it's up to you to find a way together to come up with a solution that's viable for everyone. And in the end, we went from 3 green side streets to more than 100 in Rosemont Petite Patrie, because people realized that the word public is very important when we talk about public spaces, and public spaces belong to everyone. And so we have to allow the citizens to generate experimentation and innovation. So why was there such an uptake? It's because people realized that they could, in fact, appropriate this public space, and it became an extension of their private space in their private lives. We reduced the social isolation, the isolation of vulnerable people, because people could see each other and talk to each other. We increased the feeling of belonging among citizens, and we created a community that by itself was generating more ideas and more innovative approaches. So imagine that within a small residential area, all of us imagine the kind and quality of professional expertise you have within a neighborhood. When we talk to urban planners, they were saying, well, the citizens don't have the knowledge and the expertise, and they'll do any. They're not competent. We're going to end up with a hodgepodge. But I told them, you realize that citizens think the same thing of you. So it's important to give the green light, and this created social acceptability, and it allowed us to convert those who were reticent to change. And then people realized, so maybe we could go even further, and we can experiment with other things. For example, there are 3 green side streets that started a cooperative, an energy cooperative. And this was funded by the STM and other organizations. So they dug geothermal wells, community geothermal wells, and they are going to share geothermal energy between themselves. And all of that was done, executed, and managed by the citizens. So there's an organization that's called Solon that is also providing engineering expertise. So when I talk about the scale of intervention and the level of governance, this is what I mean, is to allow that kind of project to go ahead. And of course, it requires a lot of data, a lot of information. Without information, without evidence, without knowledge, it wouldn't be possible to accelerate innovation. And for open innovation, you need open data. And so I've heard an elected official once, and I'm not going to tell you his name, that Montreal was going way too far with open data because journalists were able to use this data against the city. Well, I would say it's rather the opposite. If everybody has access to the same data that allows them to make a decision, and if we base our decision-making on open data and knowledge, then it justifies our decision-making if they're taken, of course, based on this open data. And communities of practice are really important too, because yes, we have to test ideas, and we have to also dare to fail, because whoever says innovation, of course, involves experimentation, and you can't experiment with a guarantee of success in every instance. But by inspiring ourselves of previous experiments, we can improve our chance of success. So it's important that there's an urban diplomacy. You have to be a member of many organizations and take examples. You have to look at what's being done in the communities of practice at the local and regional level. And as you were saying, yes, they're all snowflakes, but it's all snow. But by seeing what's being done around and elsewhere, it's a source of inspiration. Well, I have at least a dozen questions after what you've just said, but let's come back to the idea of scale. So when you want to attempt innovation, of course, you should target it with a solution that is at scale to the intended target. So what are the important criteria? And maybe Monsieur Miron has ideas on that, because it has to do with the way that we want to operationalize objectives. So we want to reduce risks and increase social acceptability. Yes, well, the idea of scale is very important. And risk it's important to drive change, of course. So change for us, there are 5 or 6 major stakeholders, the private public sector, researchers, funding, civil society, and also multilateral cooperation organizations. So yes, the public sector can give the major orientations, but they're going to hit a wall if society civil is not ready to take it up. But civil society may want a green economy, but if there's no funding or research is not able to provide innovative solutions, nothing will happen. So at the OEF and EFTV, that's the way we see our role. It is to drive change, because we can take the risk. We are not a funding agency, but we do have budgets that does give us the possibility of initiating new projects and launching new ideas, and to do it at scale. An example, in 2015, 2016, so the first city where we did some supporting, we had supported Burkina Faso in launching its sustainable development initiative, and the city in the north end of the city, I said, well, I want to know what OBDs are, and I want to do my local development plan. So we supported them in drawing up the plan, and we realized that energy was a fundamental building block of this plan. So I'm a Quebecer, of course. I pay the hydroelectric rates. But this city in the north of Burkina Faso pays 10 times what we pay in Quebec. So there's no electricity approximately a third of the time. And of course, they use generators because the buildings are made out of concrete and it's hot. But this is how it's done. So that's the way buildings are done. And and we need a lot of energy. But at the same time, I could see the amount of money that was being spent at the municipal level for generators and electricity, and it was totally unrealistic. So we decided to start implementing the installation of solar panels. But we realized that by using part of the land with a small solar panel, we were able to provide 100% of the energy needs of the city hall, including a reception hall used for weddings. And there was a return on investment at the time within 6 years for panels that are guaranteed for about 25 years. So it seemed perfect. The budget was about 50,000 euros, about 80,000 dollars Canadian. So the first thing the city said, listen, we can't borrow from the bank. The law won't allow it. So that was the first wall, the first obstacle, and solar panels. Well, you have to explain what the project involves to people. So we said, well, listen, we'll fund the project. So we co-funded it. We built the panels, and then we did a follow-up because, of course, yes, there's a return on investment, but that means that we don't want to double the energy consumption because it's now less expensive. And then we realized that the dust diminished the efficiency of the panels, so we had to implement some cleanup technology. But finally, we were able to drastically lower the energy costs of the municipality, and which allowed them to invest those funds in health and education and other things. So it's important to have not only a funding agency, but a partner who is willing to take a risk, who is willing to also mentor, coach, support, and then speak to the state, the higher level state, to say, listen, we can replicate this same project. So it's important to drop partnerships with other funding agencies as well. And we'll get the panels are going to be there for 25 and 30 years, and within 7 to 8 years, the loan will be refunded. So it's feasible in the long run. But these are important changes in outlook, because when we first arrived with this idea, people didn't understand. Because as we said earlier, we tend to always stick with the solutions that we've always used. And in this case, it was using generators that cost a lot. So we were able to document the project and then lift all the other obstacles that we, for example, the possibility of cities to borrow from the bank. So it was certainly a lot easier, more easily said than done. So Burkina Faso, given the security concerns in the city or in the country, it's difficult. But it's an important example because it shows what can be done if we come up with a project that is at scale, a compatible scale. There are questions in the room. If you have other comments to this idea of scale, well, I have a second question to give you before we open up the floor for questions. So we talked about being radical, and I really like the idea. So do the scientific data that we have allow us to be radical, given the way that we provide scientific information, the way we provide this information to municipalities as scientists? Does this allow municipalities to make radical choices? And do municipalities have the proper tools and the proper data? Not sufficiently, no. For many reasons. First of all, when it comes to the funding of municipalities, the cities are on the front line of the crisis. We saw it with the health crisis, same thing with climate change. The cities are the ones that have to deal with the problems, immediate problems that arise, whether it be environmental, social, or economic. And they don't have the resources needed to successfully deal with all these challenges. And there are three kinds of fundamental data that we can work on. So there's research data, of course. Research data are in the form of reports. And very often municipal services will request reports to various university departments or colleges because the director knows somebody who happens to be a research chair because they are graduates of that university, and so it's possible to award a contract to get a report or a study. And it's not necessarily a reproducible study. It's very specific, and it's not necessarily easily transferable. And these studies are not available to other services in the city. Very often, it's the exclusive purview of the particular person or service that requested it. So these reports or this data is not disseminated. If I take the example of the City of Montreal, when I was responsible for higher learning, I realized that over the 7 years, the City of Montreal had invested between $10 to $14 million on scientific studies paid to higher learning establishments. But none of those reports were available to the rest of the organization. The data wasn't digital, it wasn't easily transferable, so there could have been redundancy from one district to another where the same kind of request was made for research. The second important data was more static data, such as StatScan, where the data cycle is very long. And it is useful to assert useful, but only in the long term, and it doesn't allow to develop more resilient and better adapted policies within the municipality. And because the data that is the most important is the daily data that can be collected in real time. That's the most precious. For example, the state of underground and ducting, the quality, air quality, road status, and those are the kinds of data that we need to work on social accessibility and the rest.
qui peut
I'll give you a simple example to better understand how this daily data that can be regenerated can be efficient. The city of Montreal has systematically installed sensors on all its sewers and pipes every time they replace them. So it means 65–70% of the network is like that. So the city can know in real time the exact situation of the network. So that enables to plan in a very good way. And we can say that within 10, 20, 30 years, the state of the network will be such. And this is at what pace we need to do transformation. However, what is not connected to this fundamental data are other data that would enable us to make better decisions, innovate, and make radical transformation. So let's imagine that you link to that data another step, that's the percentage of mineralization of urban soil. So why am I mentioning that? It's because the more soil is mineral, the less the water will penetrate the soil and the water will go in the aqueduct system. For example, a soil mineralized at 90%, while the first 2 or 3 millimeters of rain will go into the soil, but after 4 millimeters, all the rain goes in the sewers. So imagine the abundant rain we sometimes have. That means even if you replace 100% of your underground network, for as long as you don't replace the surface of the soil, you'll simply be putting a lot of pressure on your infrastructure and you won't be able to have any changes. So if you're putting this data of mineralization of the soil when you do your subsoil work, rather than simply changing the pipes, we'll plan differently on how we build up the soil to have less pressure on the network. And the other important component is if you take into account air quality data. Well, why air? Because the more the soil is mineral, the more there's heat island effects. And when there's a heat wave, the air quality is lesser. We realize in cities like Montreal and others that the more concrete there is on the ground, the more heat there is, and that's also where the most vulnerable people live. That's where the people are most affected by climate change, higher temperatures, more rainfall. It's where the most vulnerable people are. So the locations in Montreal where there's most concrete with the highest heat island effects, where the most vulnerable people are also places where there's fewest municipal infrastructure, parks, leisure, sports infrastructure. And we realize also that's where there had been the greatest number of community contamination during the COVID crisis. That's also where there had been the most problems of housing. And I went from the pipes to go to the sanitary situation. So all that to show that when you take this critical data and you add it up gradually, you can see the consequences and you can see the general plan of urban planning and have better situation and be more incremental in your activities. But that costs a fortune in the digital infrastructure and the capacity. So it means you need to be able to help other cities. So open innovation is necessary for the digital aspect. That's why when I was responsible for the smart city, all the algorithms that are developed in the city of Montreal are open and available to all the international community to take them for free. So that's why we have to open up the most data as possible in cities. We have to use the infrastructure that the government implemented to open up the most data possible. And that's also why there should be those communities of practice so that we can exchange our digital tools and allow the cities to have the most data to make the best decision possible. Thank you very much. I think we have someone here and then the questions of the room because we're running out of time. Well, I just want to add to what François was saying. It's true, it's expensive, and we're in full inflation in municipal budgets. there's sexy expenditure and spending that's not sexy. So if we spend on infrastructure, people don't necessarily see it. If we invest in collecting data, people don't understand that. It'll be good for in a few years. We'll spend more now to spend less later, but we have to reduce leisure, culture, and other things. So it's really an important issue. Innovation is slowed down by that a lot. And right now the budgets are painful when we have inflation directly in cities and in daily life. Thank you. So we have a question there, and I'll start there. So we'll do short answers, please. Hello, and thank you for the panel, Madsen Redden. First of all, I want to underline in the conference on science policy, I think the point of view of municipalities is critical. So thank you. It's also a great chance of connecting that directly with society and communities in the field. A question I have for you, and I come back to the title of the session, that's really how do we get better evidence? Recently, the Council of Innovation of Quebec announced a partnership for training on innovation. So how we can better train the actors in economic development to accompany the actors in the municipal level in cities to innovate. But I would say there's a distinction to be made with the access to data and for the development of policies. So my question would be, what would that look like to give the tools to ambassadors who can accompany cities and municipalities in the better use of good results, good evidence from science? For the data, one of the challenges we see in municipalities is the compatibility of data. How do we collect them? How do we store them? How do we calculate? What format do we use? I would say that one of the added value would be standardization of data. That way we can exchange those data. We're speaking the same computer language. When you end up at the municipal level, making decisions in the acquisition of program. In Quebec, a few years ago, a municipal manager was very popular. I don't know if that's still the typical program, but all the municipalities that had the municipal managers were speaking the same language for data. If there was a decision for municipal administration to not take that IT program, then we don't have access to the same data. We don't speak the same language. So we have difficulty in sharing our data. It could be interesting if we try to make decisions in a more regional structure. So I'd say that that's a challenge, the standardization of data, compatibility of one program to the other to be able to use them in decision making in an efficient and quick way. That's a challenge to come to a municipality and say you didn't make the right choice for the IT system, so it's going to cost you $50,000 to be able to have the database from someone else. And often municipalities are not necessarily tooled to make the right choice for that structure of data. They will sometimes get persuaded by a supplier that that's the best option. So we need a way to compare service offers to know which one's most used, that kind of stuff, to reach our objectives. That's interesting. And to make a collective choice that makes sense for the whole of the collectivity. I have a question here. Patrick Montfort, a researcher at the CNRS in France, and I work on these questions of cities in on the Mediterranean coast. So for me, these are social ecosystems. It's important to consider a city as a social ecosystem. That way, the permanence of administrations will advance the system beyond the changes in policies. because politicians have faced issues, whatever their position, they have to manage situations. So one of the examples is one aspect is the administration of tourism. I work on the Mediterranean, and there are coastal cities built in the 60s where 30,000 people live year-round, and in the summer it's 3 million tourists. So the biggest spots in terms of marinas or campsites. So that generates huge issues. You don't need more detail, but today is the question of how to get citizens to participate and the tourists to participate, so that they are no longer just a consumer who come to a site, but they also come to participate and to go towards this sustainability that we're looking for. There's also the issue of sea level rising, and there's also the question of negative advertising as regards mass tourism, and to make mayors understand, for example, such as in Toulouse, that the Chinese coming back in Toulouse after pandemic is not the best solution right now. We need something else. So in your thought process, could you tackle these issues? Tourism happens also in Canada, maybe not in the same way, but what are the consequences? Well, that's a good question, because we saw that directly with the COVID crisis on the issue of the economy or the economic future of cities, where there's a strong strategy linked to tourism. Downtowns become very dependent on tourism, and the economic development that follows means that if there's a huge downturn of tourism, then there'll be an important downturn in number of businesses, etc. And when we experienced COVID, what I found fascinating was to see how much we invested so many billions of dollars everywhere on the planet to maintain the system, not try and think, how could we prepare for next time? How could we be more resilient as a territory? We had a huge opportunity. Everybody was home, was working from home, almost no one on the roads, no one traveling. And instead of saying, well, let's become more resilient, because it was like a first strike compared to what was coming with COVID, and first crisis, and we could have wondered how to make sure that our cities are more resilient. So why not focus more on proximity? Carlos Moreno developed the theory of the city where everything is within 15 minutes. How can we make sure that the economy in our cities are more resilient? We don't need so much tourism, that it's not necessary that our downtown survives through tourism. We had a huge opportunity and we didn't do it. We simply invested to save the existing system. And today, we have to admit that we're still dependent everywhere on tourism, and nothing changed. The next great crisis will bring it right up on the agenda for us, and I don't know what we'll be able to do. But we won't have a choice one day but to say that this model of huge scales economy in big cities that depend on tourism is not sustainable. And if we want to be resilient, we'll have to think seriously about that. And one of the solutions, I come back to the question of innovation, we'll have to make sure that innovation goes with the economy department, and it's also social, and we often forget that. Thank you, and we're talking about crisis and resilience. So Marie-Christine. Thank you, hello. I'm Marie-Christine Terrien. I'm a professor at the National Public Administration School, and I work on resilience and city governance. And I work with Unicité, supported by the Chief Scientist of Quebec, to develop the space of science for urban policies. Because we can see, and we've heard through the panelists, that there's a lack of science to policy towards the urban setting. It almost doesn't exist. So I would have a quick proposal and a question. I would have a proposal to change the title of your panel. I think that evidence and data is fundamental under all those forms. You mentioned that, but what I often heard in the panel was that there's still problems of mechanisms in all your presentation. I think with higher levels or regional levels, there are discussions to be had, and I'm just wondering if your panel shouldn't be called "How can we create urban public value?" So is that need to have a discussion at a level that means that a whole bunch of partners, no one mentioned the Ministry of Housing or Urban Development, that have great capacity to support municipalities. In Quebec, there's over 1,000. So that's incredible. But that was just a proposal. We can discuss that collectively. My question is also linked to that, is that the cities have a huge number of challenges that are simultaneous. How can we have this link between the competition of 112 urban issues, because there's a whole bunch, and at the same time, the fact that we increase public participation and that we create a balance with public administration has a role to play. So that triangle of balance between the citizen, public administration, and policies has maybe a role to play. So what I'll do, because there's very little time, I will take very quickly the questions and I'll let you speak once. That way we'll only go over 10 minutes and not 15. So thank you for your quick question. Ewan Saint-Onge, you speak a lot of urbanization, but for us we have 17,000 lakes and a huge number of rivers, and I wanted to know, is it on your radar? But also in terms of fiscality, that is something that is being discussed to raise the value of those areas, watershed areas that help the resilience, but also for a renewed tourism sector not focused on cities, but maybe on nature. Great question, and I invite you to ask your question also. Yes, essentially I was going down the same road as my colleague over there. There's a lot of innovation created in universities and in that kind of institution. And I'm sorry I missed the beginning of the panel, but there's a lot of innovation coming out of there, and it's often difficult to come out of the academic sector. Is there an opening of municipalities to collaborate with institutions? And that means that there's a greater impact of research for the public, and I'm speaking of universities, but it can be different stakeholders, so we have better impact of innovation from this. And I feel that science shouldn't be a political line in the budget. Science and innovation should be something that's out of policies because it's non-partisan, essentially. Thank you very much. So as we reach the end of our time, I suggest you quickly give one last word, maybe 2 minutes max. So the question on political involvement, administrative and social, is very important. François was talking about the issue of when a new party arrives. Sometimes it's difficult to install a new policy, and that's very true. I think it's a teamwork that has to be done, everyone together, and we have to be aware that we have a role to play, and this role is complementary. We're not in competition. I'm not competing with municipal reps. I'm there to set a vision they have on the city, and my vision is to include that in administration, even if someone's been there for 25 years. We were talking about the environmental challenge. That's an important issue. I mean, in the Laurentides, there's a huge number of lakes and playgrounds, as I call them. And we can see that in the south, there's more and more concern linked to climate change. And when we speak to our cities of the north that have changed some issues, it's not always easy to communicate and to understand that if Mirabel develops greatly and Sainte Thérèse, that's just south, has more and more floods, it's maybe because we've played on that. And when we want to work together, they say, no, it's not our issue, it's not our problem, we won't invest, we won't help you. And lastly, what I see for about 20 years in the municipal world is that we're working more and more with universities and research chairs. When we do renewal in cities and we're changing the streets, when we have innovations, flooding, we work more and more with the university sector. Thank you, Mr. Schreber. So on the question of biodiversity and the question of universities, it's a good question. I won't go on the issue of municipal taxation, but there's still a strong, important component on the value of nature and the value of natural infrastructure. That's a concept that exists in theory, natural infrastructure, but is not in practice integrated in the accounting sheets of cities. A quick example, when you plant a tree for a city, it's not considered as capitalizable infrastructure. It comes from the operating expenses, and so when you're a city, you can't have a deficit, which means that if you don't have a budget envelope dedicated to planting trees and their maintenance between 3 to 5 years, the number of trees is limited by the capacity of paying. Whereas if we could consider that a tree is an infrastructure, we could capitalize the investment and deploy things in a greater way. And that's for all the environmental events. The other budget question linked to nature is for tariffs. The bill on cities and towns establish a scale of penalties when someone cuts a tree down. Those fines are maxed out at $5,000 per fine, however the number of trees you cut. Imagine you have a company that's in Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie and decides to cut down 300 trees on their property without a permit. Each tree can have a max of $250 as a fine, but with a maximum of $5,000 a fine. Cut 10 or 300 for a company for $5,000 a fine is not a big deal. So if we assess the real actual cost, economic cost, social and ecological cost of a tree, and if the law was changed there, we would completely change things, and that would give more fiscal power to cities. And quickly on universities, something we have to understand is the difficulty of understanding the needs and the roles of everyone. That is that a city too often will use researchers for their own need without considering that the study generated by university could favor the emergence of more studies. And what is fundamental research for? You have to have this dialogue so that there's an exchange, because the daily work of civil servants, professionals, engineers in a city can also contribute to generate data for researchers and create new knowledge, and that is where there's a lack. So the cities need to stop only using research work, but that there be an exchange of knowledge favoring the emergence of knowledge. Thank you. So we'll bring our relationship to another level. That's what I'm hearing. Yes, in 30 seconds on the competition of issues. It is true here. I can tell you that for having worked in Togo and Ivory Coast, other African countries, when you come to cities and you say we will favor the objectives of SDGs, but everything's a priority, even more so than here. Even more so because the 169 targets of the SDGs are still a compromise, international compromise. 169 targets, 169 that we kept as being the most important. And when we do this typical exercise, we gather this stakeholders in Africa, There, who knows the SDGs? No one. You present the targets, and the initial reaction is to say, "Oh, that's very important." Target 2, oh, that's very important, and they're all very important. So the idea is we tell them, prove it to me. Prove it to me that it's very important. What are your risks? What are your opportunities? If you don't reach the target, what happens? Is it the end of the city? What happens? So prove it to me with your risks and opportunities. Tell me what are the specific issues, and from there we'll try having a better picture to prioritize the important actions, and we'll realize that some issues come out regularly, climate change, water, etc. And we'll say that by working on different focuses, I can positively contribute to reaching my 7 or 8 priorities, and I can have the best possible impact. So that's what I will be working on in the next few years. We won't put the rest aside. We'll just keep it, but we'll focus on the low-hanging fruit and what will have the best impact based on the issues that are recurrent. That is the work that we do with cities. Thank you. And Mr. Laurier, last word. Yes, for natural assets, I invite you to stay informed, because there's a lot of movement on conservation, the importance of conservation, to recognize the importance of natural assets and management of natural assets for municipalities. The federal government works on a strategy that should come out very soon, and there should be programs coming out of this. So I invite you to look at that. For the FCM, we have worked on natural assets, whether the program level or adaptation to climate change. Municipalities and rural sectors are very aware of their assets, and we have great examples of planning of growth that happened around natural assets, with the outlook of protecting a lake, or making strategic decisions on 15 years to make sure that the drinking water is maintained. We can see it more and more in our communities, in our rural communities. And for partnerships with universities, it is still very case by case, but there are a lot of financing organizations that focus more on the economy, research and the economy. And now at the Canadian Federation of Municipalities, we have contacts where they've developed municipal sectors. The program MyTax does financing for research and have developed over the last 2 years a municipal sector, and we're discussing with them how we can do co-financing on projects. The federal councils for subsidies, that's right. But there are municipal sectors that were developed, and I think that it could go through there, but also through municipal associations. So each province has their own, they know their membership and their needs for the members, so it could be a good avenue to explore. So that's a great conclusion. We have great collaborations to explore amongst the municipal organizations. The subsidies funds has a lot to do, and I'll leave you because lunch is served. I will simply say that at the head scientist's office, as you probably know, the president of the International Network for Governmental Advice, and we'll be developing a North American office in the next few years, and we decided that that office would be focused on municipal aspects. So we have a great territory here on North America to try and conceive those partnerships and those collaborations between cities. So I'll leave you on that, and I look forward to seeing you later. Thank you.